be meeting with the ladies at 2 o'clock this afternoon to discuss ways to reach out to women who are experiencing problems in their lives. And then Jeff is going to meet with the group tomorrow to see what we can do about establishing a recovery group, an addiction recovery group here at church, and designing our own recovery group. And so there are a lot of exciting things that are going on, and we're so happy to have Jeff and Robin here with us to help. When Amy and I were at the mission workshop at Sunset in January, Jeff taught a session there about addiction and dealing with addiction and the aftermath of addiction, and that was exactly what we were looking for because we had already been talking about that. It was just by accident that was the first session I went to, was Jeff's session. That was exactly what we wanted to find, and so we were really, really thrilled to make contact with Jeff. So I'm going to turn this over to Jeff and let him go till Chuck rings the bell twice, and then we'll break for our service.
Well, good morning. It's nice to see so many people. Gary kind of gave me the impression that there might not be hardly anybody here because of fear of the Wuhan flu. And I promise I am not a Chinese operative who was sent to plant this. As far as I know, I'm healthy, at least as healthy as I get. But thank you so much for the invitation to be here. Gary, I really appreciate it, and we're excited to be here, and we're also excited that this congregation is interested in reaching out to those struggling with addiction. And one of the things that we're going to be talking about today is what an incredible need there is for this kind of ministry. Now, I want to start by sharing a startling little-known fact, and that is that most addicts come from unhealthy homes. Can you imagine that? Very few people know this, but it's true. The fact of the matter is, happy homes, healthy homes, tend to produce happy, healthy people. And happy, healthy people don't usually wind up struggling with addiction. So I want to spend some time this morning talking about homes. We're going to first start with healthy homes. What makes a home healthy? You know, it's the sort of thing where I imagine a lot of people say, well, I don't know. I know one when I see one. But of course, that's not always true either, because sometimes people are very good at hiding. Especially dysfunctional families, oftentimes they have the family secret that is guarded at all costs. But before we can really appreciate what an unhealthy home looks like, let's talk about healthy ones. Now, the most obvious characteristic of a healthy home is that both parents are present. That was God's original intention, and it still works the best, without a doubt. Both parents are very clearly the leaders of the home. I'm sure you've encountered families where the children have learned how to manipulate their parents with tantrums and threats and all sorts of embarrassing behavior. In a healthy home, that doesn't happen. Or if it does, it gets nipped in the bud pretty quickly, because a home just simply can't be healthy if the parents aren't the leaders of the home. They're the adults. Kids don't know that much. Adults know a lot more. In a healthy home, both parents are committed to each other and to their children. It's not a part-time thing. It's something that they take very seriously. Both parents have their children's best interest in mind, and they understand that in order to be the parents God wants, they're there to meet the children's needs, not vice versa. You know, the children are there not just to be free labor. You've got to parent them. And part of that is they do their best to create an environment of love and respect for every family member. No scapegoats in a healthy family. No black sheep. They're very involved in their children's lives. They know what their kids are up to. They know what their kids like, what their hobbies are, who their friends are. I don't mean over-parenting, but they are aware of their children's world. There's healthy communication in a healthy home. And when I say that, what I mean is that everyone feels like they have the right to share their thoughts, their beliefs, their feelings, their experiences, and that they can do that without being criticized or ridiculed. Does that make sense? Yes. In a healthy home, the parents actually model the family rules and values and morals. They don't just lecture about them. It's not do as I say, not as I do. They actually do model them. And because of that, the children tend to take these rules and morals and beliefs seriously. It's kind of hard to take mom and dad seriously when they make no effort to walk the talk. Also, not only does the family have rules, but the rules don't change, except when they have to, because of a change in circumstances. It's not a question of, it's Tuesday, what rules are in effect today? The rules don't change at the parents' whim, and the kids know what the rules are. Everybody knows what's expected of them. There's no surprises. Mom and dad aren't hiding behind a corner waiting for someone to mess up so that they can come down on them like a ton of bricks. Not only does the family have rules, but the children, they know what the rules are, and they are taught that there are legitimate reasons for these rules. It's more than just, you do it because I say so. No, the parents actually teach the kids why you should or should not do this. The parents realize their job is as teachers. And the Bible makes that very clear. The parents show love for their kids. They exhibit the morals, and they lead rather than just dominating. Some families, especially dad, he is kind of the dictator. You've heard of the golden rule, them that's got the gold make the rules. Well, some families are like that. My cousins grew up like that. My uncle was a commander in the Navy, and he couldn't leave it at the base. When he came home, it was Captain Bligh, and the kids told me later in life that things were kind of tense a lot of times. But if the parents are doing their job the way they should, the children are going to look at them as legitimate authority figures that they can respect and who they will go to when they need advice. Mom and dad are not people to be afraid of because you never know what they're going to do next. Mom and dad, they love us, and they're the smartest people I know. So that's who I go to. They understand that conflict happens in a family. Unhealthy homes oftentimes try to pretend that conflict never happens. No, ours is the perfect home. Well, in a healthy home, the parents understand there is no such thing as a perfect home, and whenever you have more than one person present, there's going to be conflict. And they're prepared to help resolve it, to do it fairly and with respect. Now, if the parents are Christians, then they understand that they have those kids on loan from God. The kids are not their personal property. They are stewards. And we Christians, we understand stewardship. That's when you are managing the property of another. And these children belong to God. And God expects us to bring them up in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. And then when they're ready to leave the nest, return them to God as godly young men and women who love God and want to serve Him. Now, I think it goes without saying, if the parents are Christians, we hope that the Bible is being studied and prayer is happening as a family. Because if the kids don't see it at home, oftentimes they won't take it that seriously. And this is especially true about fathers. If fathers don't go to church, kids oftentimes grow up with the idea that religion is for women and children. Any of you remember the Waltons? I had one problem with that show. Dad never went to church, and he was quite vocal about it. Not till almost the last episode before it went off the air. But that's terrible. Kids need to see that Dad takes religion seriously, because he's the one that they're really watching. But whether the parents are religious or not, in a healthy home, the parents realize their ultimate obligation is to prepare their kids for adulthood, to prepare them to leave the nest. That means that they should be helping their kids to discover what their giftedness is. What are the kids good at? What do they like to do? What comes relatively easy for them? And then hopefully try to figure out some way that they can use their giftedness to earn a living. In an unhealthy home, parents are too liable to try to live out their own fantasies through their kids. You know, I always wanted to be Joe Namath, so I make my son go out for football even if he hates it. You know, he'd rather be playing the saxophone, but no, Dad wants me to be the star quarterback. That's not healthy. Well, when a family is healthy, when the parents have been relatively successful, I mean, there's no perfect parents, there's no perfect home, but when the parents have tried to live this kind of way and establish this kind of a family, typically the family members will share the same beliefs. They will be committed to each other. They'll have a healthy sense of their own self-worth. And when the time comes for them to leave the nest, they'll be ready. They'll be ready to leave as responsible, law-abiding, autonomous young adults. And the parents can go, "Whew, we did our job. Hallelujah. Thank you, Lord." Well, that's what a healthy home looks like. But we also need to look at homes that aren't so healthy, because there's a huge tie between unhealthy homes and addiction. Now, unhealthy homes come in basically two forms. First is the broken home. And a broken home is a home where there's only one parent present for whatever reason. And there can be lots of reasons. One of the parents is deceased. One of the parents has abandoned the family. Maybe they've divorced or separated. Maybe they were never married and the father was never in the picture, if his identity is even known. Sometimes there's only one parent because of incarceration. Sometimes it's because of employment. For example, if someone's in the military and they're deployed overseas in military conflict, while they're away from the home, that home is broken. Now, hopefully, Dad or Mom will come home, and then the home will be whole again. But then there are other situations where, for example, the wage earner has to work several low-paying jobs to pay the rent, and as a result is rarely around. Sometimes the main wage earner is far more comfortable at work than he or she is at home. And so they become a workaholic. Their job is the one place where they feel like they're competent and they know what they're doing and they're comfortable. They may not be comfortable being parents because that's messy. But there are other situations. Even worse, of course, is when the family is such that Child Protective Services, or whatever they're called here in Kansas, intervene, and the child is actually taken out of the home and put in a foster home or a children's home. But in any of these cases, the child is not being raised in a home where both parents are present as God intended. Now, especially in cases of separation and divorce, children oftentimes feel guilty, believe it or not. It's unrealistic guilt, but you know the way kids are. They think the world revolves around them, and they often overemphasize the significance of their actions on their world. So, for example, if the parents break up, little Johnny may be thinking that he was the cause. You know, if only I'd been a better boy, Daddy wouldn't have left. But along with the feelings of guilt, there are also feelings of abandonment. You know, I guess Mommy or Daddy really didn't want me. Or maybe they didn't really love me. I must not be worth that much. It's not uncommon for a child to feel abandoned even by the custodial parent. That's because the parent with the child, normally mom, she's got her own issues. And, you know, her attention may be scattered in so many different directions that Junior is just not getting the attention he needs. And if the custodial parent remarries, then things can get worse because the newlyweds are devoting so much of their attention to each other in what they hope will be an idyllic marriage that Junior feels even more abandoned. Or worse, if the stepfather or stepmother brings his or her own kids, and we have a blended family, then Junior can just feel lost in the shuffle. So, I mean, there was a time when people tried to say that divorce was no big deal. This was especially at the height of the women's liberation movement. But we now know that that's not the case. We know that fathers play an incredibly important role in the lives of their children. In fact, research shows that when a child grows up without his or her biological father, that there are all sorts of horrible consequences. These are the kids most likely to grow up in poverty. These are the kids most likely to be abused by some other adult. They're the kids most likely to do poorly in school or drop out of high school. They're the most likely to have mental and emotional problems. They're the most likely to get involved in drugs and alcohol. They're the most likely to wind up joining a gang. They're the most likely to engage in criminal behavior. They're the most likely to wind up behind bars. In fact, it's estimated that 70% of Americans who are serving long-term sentences in the penitentiary grew up without their dad. And unfortunately, these are the kids most likely to commit suicide. But what's really frightening, as if that weren't enough, it's now estimated that about 40% of America's kids are growing up without their father. So the prison systems of America do not have to worry about running out of clients. It's just going to keep getting worse until we do something, because kids growing up without a father is without a doubt a recipe for disaster. Now, dysfunctional families are another form of unhealthy family. There can either be just one parent or that both parents can be there. You know, a family with one parent is broken, but even if both parents are there, that's no guarantee that this is going to be a healthy place to grow up in. They can be unhealthy because one or both parents is an addict. One or both parents is involved in criminal activity. One or both parents is mentally ill. One or both parents is abusive to other family members. One or both parents have unresolved hurts from their own childhood. They've got lots of baggage that they've never gotten help for. And now those problems are invading the present. And one of the things we need to understand is that's the way it usually works. Issues from childhood don't just heal themselves. It's not something that time heals. They don't go away with time. They don't just stay in the past. They continue to follow us wherever we go and invade our present. And they can affect everyone in the family. Another way that families can be dysfunctional is when one family member, typically one of the parents, is ill. I already mentioned mental illness, but even in cases of physical illness, what oftentimes happens in a dysfunctional family is one of the parents is monopolizing the family's time and energy for whatever reason, and nobody else's needs in the family are getting met. But the common denominator in a dysfunctional family is that one or both parents is not functioning in the manner intended by God. And obviously, to the extent any family fails to meet our criteria or characteristics of a healthy home, they're dysfunctional. So every home is dysfunctional to some degree. I mean, that's just a given. So don't beat yourself up if, you're not Mr. Rogers. But still, dysfunctional families can do horrible damage. In fact, it's broken and dysfunctional families that are oftentimes the breeding grounds for child abuse. Now, child abuse comes in a variety of forms, variety of flavors. There's sexual abuse, physical abuse, verbal abuse, neglect, and emotional abuse. And of these forms, sexual abuse is probably the worst. It seems to do the most damage, although all of them do damage, and the damage is very similar despite the form of abuse. But sexual abuse can include anything, from fondling to penetration by anything. It can include exhibitionism, voyeurism, exposing the victim to pornography. Truthfully, sexual abuse can involve any kind of sexual behavior that the human mind can conceive of. The possibilities are almost limitless. And all of it is traumatic, but the severity of the trauma seems to be dependent on a few factors. One, the relationship of the abuser to the victim. We know that in many, many cases, the abuser is a family member. The estimates go anywhere from a quarter of cases to half. And I don't know which is exactly right. But the worst case of all seems to be when it's the father. When it's the father abusing a child. It's like that's the ultimate betrayal. But abuse by other family members is also very typical. And it seems to do more damage than if the abuse is by a non-family member or a stranger. Another factor is the presence or threat of violence. Being raped at knife point tends to do a lot of damage, as you can imagine. There's the issue of the duration of the abuse. Did it happen once, or did it happen repeatedly over years? The age of the child. How old was he or she when this started? And again, how long did it go on? Also important is the reaction of the family. Now, if the family finds out and immediately acts to protect the child, to make sure the child is protected, and tries to get the child the help he or she needs, then the child typically does a lot better, has a much greater chance of recovering. Unfortunately, this is often not the case. And this, of course, just compounds the injury. So often, the family doesn't believe it, or doesn't want to believe it. But in any event, I should say that even though these various factors play a role in a majority of the cases, I can't discount the fact that some people are totally traumatized by a single act. Say like a teenage girl who's the victim of date rape. I've known of cases where they were suicidal for months. So the severity of the trauma seems to depend as much upon the nature and makeup of the victim as it does other factors. But let me share some statistics that just might blow your mind. There are over 42 million adult survivors of childhood sexual abuse. And they're the ones that have come forward. These are the ones that have admitted what happened. Research suggests that 1 in 4 girls, and maybe as many as 1 in 6 boys, will be sexually abused before the age of 18. Now, some say with boys it's really more like 1 out of 10. But whichever one it is, it's too many. I think we all need to understand that sexual abuse is incredibly traumatic, and the impact is usually lifelong, and the impact is usually pretty awful. We know that, for example, 80% of women who end up as prostitutes or end up in the adult porn industry were sexually abused as children. And that's one of the common effects. The victim becomes sexually promiscuous. The victim may suffer from gender confusion if homosexuality was involved. The victim may find it difficult to ever have normal, healthy sexual behavior, a sexual relationship with anyone. Likely, they are going to suffer with fear, anxiety, and depression for the rest of their lives. And because it is so traumatic, it's very common for them to turn to a variety of addictions as a coping mechanism. Physical abuse also does profound damage. Now, we can quibble as to what constitutes physical abuse. Certainly, whenever bones are broken, or blood is spilled, or burns, welts, bruises are left, I'd say that's physical abuse. Even spanking can be abusive if the adult doing it is out of control, or if they're using excessive force and a blunt instrument, or if they're hitting with their fist. Now, one that used to happen quite often was spanking a child in public in order to humiliate them. That happens less often these days because you're liable to get arrested for child abuse if you do that in the middle of Walmart. And that might be just as well. I don't know. It's far better if you have a small child that's misbehaving. Take them out to the car, and this is between mom and child. This has nothing to do with the general public. Of course, physical evidence, unfortunately, can also happen without leaving any evidence whatsoever. These are parents who will lock a child in a closet for hours, or the basement, or a dark room. Besides the physical harm, of course, the harm that's done to the soul may be even more profound. Obviously, the victim is going to feel great fear towards the abuser. Physical abuse tends to break the spirit of a child. They lose their independence and self-will, usually. They tend to cower and hide whenever the abuser's around. They become experts at trying to gauge the mood of the abuser, trying to learn how to placate them so that daddy won't get angry and take it out on me. Or sometimes the child reacts in the exact opposite way, refuses to be broken, and turns into a rebel, an outlaw. Do what you want with me. You can't break me kind of attitude. And unfortunately, when that happens, they usually end up adopting all sorts of self-destructive behavior that is only hurting them, not the abuser. There's verbal abuse. That, of course, is when people use demeaning speech, where they are demeaning a person's worth or their appearance or their intelligence or their competence. Usually it involves name-calling, but not always. People who yell, scream, and carry on such that you have to walk on eggshells around them, that's verbal abuse. People who make a habit of making threats. If you don't do this, I will do this, that, or the other. That can be verbal abuse, depending on what the threat is, especially if it's a threat of violence. And you can imagine some of the things that I'm talking about. A parent who lacks maturity and self-control and says things like, "How can you be so stupid? I can't believe you're my child. I'm ashamed of you. Why can't you be like the other kids? Why can't you be like your brother? You are so lazy." Or maybe even worse, "You are just worthless." Probably the most horrible thing you could ever say to a kid is, "I wish you'd never been born." I've known 2 people in my prison ministry whose mothers said that to them. Or the variation of that is, "I should have gotten an abortion." In other words, you're saying this child has no right to even exist as far as you're concerned. Then there's neglect. Neglect is the most common form of child abuse. It's suggested that it makes up about 78% of cases, but it occurs in every other form of abuse. No matter what the kind of abuse is, the child's needs are being neglected, like the need for safety. That's a primary need, that every child needs to feel safe at home. But neglect happens in 3 basic ways. Either the parents aren't meeting the child's physical, material needs, or they're not meeting their emotional needs, or they're failing to provide parental guidance. Physical needs, food, clothing, shelter, access to medical care, access to education, access to proper hygiene. Maybe one of the saddest examples is when a pregnant woman continues her party lifestyle while pregnant. Robin and I had to deal with a young man like that who was born with fetal alcohol syndrome. His mother was a Las Vegas showgirl who continued her party lifestyle the whole time she was carrying him, and he was badly damaged. Children come into this world with all sorts of emotional problems. I mean, not problems, emotional needs. And they're pretty obvious. Things like affection, attention, acceptance. I mentioned security, validation, and encouragement. Now, what do I mean when I say validation? Validation is something that kids mostly want from dad. Validation is when a parent lets the child know, I am glad you're my child. I'm proud of you. Probably the best example that ever happened was when God said to Jesus, this is my son in whom I am well pleased. Every kid would love to hear that. So God was modeling for all fathers what you need to tell your children. Now children from mom can validate the child too, but mostly moms are good at nurture. They're there to kiss the boo-boos and hug their kids and let the kids know they're loved and make a fuss over them. And then, of course, there's guidance. Kids come into this world knowing next to nothing. I know I'm hungry. I know I'm tired. I know I have to go to the bathroom. And that's about it. And as they grow up, hopefully, they have a good enough relationship with their parents that they can ask their parents when they need advice. And we're talking, it can be intellectual things. It can be spiritual matters. It can be major life decisions. Or it can be just normal life skills. Counting on dad to teach you, how to take care of the car, how to do home remodeling. Maybe mom teaches you how to handle the checkbook. Just the stuff you need to know to get through life, and stuff that's not going to be taught in the public schools. Then there's emotional abuse. Again, this takes place in every case of child abuse. They're being abused emotionally. But some of the cases that would probably just be called emotional abuse would be things like ignoring or rejecting your child as a form of punishment, giving them the silent treatment, refusing to touch them or hug them, exposing them to violence or the abuse of others, even if it's not directed against them. Can also include what's called enmeshment. Enmeshment is where parent and child are enmeshed. It's hard to tell where one ends and the other begins, and that's usually because the parent refuses to look at the child as a separate individual. And instead, the parent looks at the child as an extension of him or herself and expects the child to have all the same preferences and beliefs and ideas as the parent does. Enmeshment can get even worse when the child is treated as a surrogate spouse. Either there is no other spouse there, or there's a real disconnect between the married couple, and one of the parents starts looking to one of the children as their confidant, or as the one they want to talk to, the one they go out to eat with, this sort of thing. It's just not healthy, because you're putting a child in a role that they're not suited for. You're not allowing them to be children. Now, regardless of the form of child abuse, all these things produce very bad consequences. And these consequences, as I said, tend to be the same regardless of the kind of abuse. And that's because the child's been wounded. The child's been damaged at the core of his or her being. You could say they have a hole in their soul. And that's just because so many of the needs that every child has just were never met. The groundwork that needed to be laid for them to grow up to be a healthy adult, it just never happened. And so the child grows up getting the constant message, whether subtle or not so subtle, that you're just not that important. You're not worth our time or attention or affection, or you're not even worth our protection. And of course, what a horrible form of betrayal. This does horrible damage to a child's normal sense of self-worth. In cases of child abuse, normal feelings of self-worth just kind of crash and burn. And the child is left feeling insecure, inferior. They feel like they don't fit in. They lack self-confidence. They don't know how to handle conflict. They don't know how to handle criticism. They're uncomfortable around other people. They find it very difficult to trust other people. They find it very difficult to form close relationships with anyone. And it's interesting, oftentimes they grow up, biologically they're an adult, but they feel like a child trapped in an adult's body. Emotionally, they're still stuck back in childhood where the abuse happened. And so the child grows up to be a broken, hurting adult who's not really situated to cope with or succeed in life. They're at a huge disadvantage. Now, one of the tragic effects is also spiritual. You might not normally think about that, but let's face it, parents are supposed to model God for their kids, especially dad. Kids tend to think of God as just a bigger, more powerful version of daddy. And when the parents fail to do this, or they do it very poorly, the kids tend to grow up with a very warped view of God. You know, you can view God as a monster, as someone who has all of dad's faults just multiplied. Or the child may not even believe that God exists. You know, the child may reason, God couldn't possibly exist, because if he did, he would never have let this happen to me. Or they may say, well, God may exist, but he must not be very good. Or even if he's basically well-meaning, he's probably not very powerful. Or, well, even if he is pretty powerful, apparently he doesn't care anything about me. Because where was he when all this was going on? Why didn't he stop it? Why did he abandon me? Or at the other end of the spectrum, if the child grows up in a religious home and comes out of it still believing in God, oftentimes, because their self-worth is so low, they become very legalistic. They can't really wrap their minds around concepts like love, grace, and mercy. They feel like they need to earn God's favor. I've got to mollify God like I had to mollify Dad. And so they're very legalistic. And of course, we know that it doesn't work. How could you possibly ever know if you've done enough to get God on your side? And of course, we know the Bible says that's not how it works at all. But unfortunately, one of the things that ties all of this together is addiction. Because these kids that grow up to be adults, and they're behind the 8 ball anyway because of everything that happened to them, they often try to cope with life in sinful, self-destructive, dysfunctional ways, which usually involve some form of addiction. And addictions come in all sorts of types. There's substance abuse, drugs or alcohol. There's behavioral addictions like sex, pornography, gambling, self-harm, eating disorders. People who constantly buy, compulsive shoppers, sometimes called retail therapy. Now, research indicates, the figure that I kept finding is that about 2/3 of those who are struggling with addiction were abused as kids. One study said, in that study at least, it was 84%. But it's one of those things, how can you determine for sure? But I hope we understand that the addictive behavior is really more of a symptom it's not the ultimate problem, because it's being driven by a whole host of mental and emotional problems usually stemming from childhood. Things like fear and depression and anxiety, deep-seated feelings of rage and shame, maybe thoughts of suicide or even attempts at suicide. And of course, again, as I already said, these kinds of problems don't just go away with time. Time does not heal these wounds. And they have a tendency to continue to influence the present until they're dealt with. And that's why, in so many cases, people struggling with addiction probably would be well advised to seek out counseling. And probably talk to a doctor and see if they might not have a condition that needs some real medication. Because a lot of times addicts have been self-medicating all their lives. But they're self-medicating in a way that's not at all effective. It doesn't solve anything. It just makes matters worse. And it's destroying their health. Often the addict is saddled with feelings of self-condemnation and self-loathing, sometimes despair. Yeah, it's a serious problem, and that's why I am so happy, so encouraged to see that this congregation is taking steps to reach out to those who are struggling with addiction. As we will continue to see today, this is a terrible problem in America, and there are countless Americans who need the help that I believe can only be provided by the church. I'm not here to run down support groups. They can serve a very good function. But in many cases, they're not enough. Like I said, they may need counseling. They may need real medication for things like anxiety and depression, bipolar, things of that nature. But what, of course, they really need is Christ. And I don't know of anybody who can tell them how to get into Christ other than members of Christ's church. Amen? Finally, we need to deal with the issue of denial. You've heard of addicts being in denial, not wanting to admit they're addicted to anything. But people who are victims of child abuse can also be in denial. Sometimes they're the hardest people to ever convince that the child abuse ever happened. And I'm running out of time, so I don't have time to tell you why it's so hard for them. But let me just say that I appreciate having the opportunity to give you this kind of nutshell overview of healthy and unhealthy homes and child abuse and their consequences. And again, to say, I just applaud you for your decision to do this kind of outreach. Thank you.